Ευχαριστώ θερμά για την πρόσκληση. Βέβαια, όπως ξέρετε από το πρόγραμμα, δεν θα μιλήσω καθόλου για τα πρόσφατα βιβλία μου, ούτε για το παρόν, τουλάχιστον άμεσα. There is a slight problem that I realized a bit late. I will be pronouncing ancient Greek names the way the Anglo-Saxons usually pronounce them. For my fellow Greeks, I will offer the equivalents as we pronounce them. It has become politically correct and therefore commonplace to depreciate Athenian democracy because of its exclusion of women and slaves. This is distinctly anachronistic and therefore uninteresting. After all, female suffrage is a recent achievement during the previous century. Slavery was abolished and outlawed also fairly recently, not to speak of its occasional local revivals nowadays. Moreover, despite its polemical usefulness, the assimilation of free female citizens to slaves is also absurd and misleading. Many of those who write about Athenian women seem to ignore even the existence of the female forms politis, with iota, and asti, despite their use in well-known ancient texts like Aristotle. If we are to judge the Athenians not by our standards but by theirs, the foremost anomaly is not the exclusion of women or slaves, but that of METICS, that is, resident aliens. Their well-defined status in classical Athens has been variously regarded as privileged or else as unfair discrimination. The contradiction that has been most discussed is that between non-citizenship and their key economic role, which is sometimes exaggerated. It is also in the economic sphere that discrimination has been most noticed, since METICS were subject to special taxation, while they could not own real property in Attica. That the military obligation imposed on the METICS should come only second, if not ignored completely, is rather odd. After all, endangering one's life is incommensurable in economic terms and should be deemed a far greater burden than taxes or property constraints. It is also odd, however, because of the linkage in ancient thought between citizenship and military service to the polis. A central argument in Aristotle's Politics, τα πολιτικά του Αριστοτέλη, is the one linking political rights to personal contribution to the defense of the polis as a fighter. Hence his precept that only those possessing arms, meaning here a hoplite's panoply, should have political rights. The same idea serves as a causal explanation in his theory of the military origins of political regimes, depending on the prevailing form of warfare, which is in turn dictated by geography. Cavalry is thus linked to oligarchy, hoplites to a moderate and broader oligarchy, which might even be called a democracy in earlier times, while light infantry and the navy to democracy. Far from being an original Aristotelian insight, as I once thought, the argument linking political rights to one's personal contribution to the defense of the polis reflects a notion that was widespread, if not commonplace, in classical Greece. In 423, for example, the Spartan general Vrasidas, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, Brasidas, I don't know, endeavored to boost the morale of his troops by arguing that in oligarchies like theirs, the few ruled the many thanks only to their superiority in battle. On another occasion, the Athenian oligarch Theramenes defended himself in 404 against the charge of inconsistency by arguing that he had always been in favor of political rights exclusively for those serving the polis with horses and with shields, that is, as cavalrymen or as hoplites. Similarly, according to the so-called old oligarch, it is just that the poor and the people, demos, should prevail in Athens, since it is they who move the warships and confer its might to the polis, far more than the hoplites, the rich, and the well-born. To paraphrase Chairman Mao, for the Greeks generally, political power grew out of a hoplite's spearhead, or perhaps a rower's oar. If it is proper that political rights should stem from one's personal military service to the polis, the exclusion of women appears straightforward. On the other hand, the military contribution of slaves was never essential for the defense of Athens. On the one occasion when it was, in 406, the slaves urgently required for the fleet were apparently offered not only their freedom, but also citizenship. Consequently, from the perspective of political rights matching military contributions, the most blatant inconsistency is not created by the women or the slaves, but by the METICS, the resident aliens of Attica. They were required to serve both in the Athenian army as hoplites and in the Athenian navy as rowers and sailors. In other words, they had essentially the same military obligations as the citizens. The only difference was that METICS were excluded from the Athenian cavalry. They were also exempted from the triarchy, presumably because alone among the liturgies, it involved not only a financial contribution, but also military authority, since the triarch, triarchos, was the captain in actual command of the trireme. On land, only METIC hoplites are explicitly mentioned. It appears that they did not participate in distant campaigns. They only guarded the walls and forts of Attica as part of the territorial army and took part only in occasional raids nearby, like the invasion of the Megarid in 431. On that occasion, Thucydides mentions the lone number of 3,000 METIC hoplites. Although precise numbers are entirely lacking, the contribution of the METICS seems to have been far more important for the Athenian navy than for the army. At the start of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles reassured the Athenians that they themselves were quite sufficient, together with the METICS, to man the fleet. Indeed, in 428, 100 additional triremes were manned by the citizens, except the top two census classes, and the METICS. For his part, the so-called old oligarch explicitly states that Athens needs METICS not only for the many trades, but also for the fleet. According to Diodorus, not slaves, but METICS and other willing foreigners were the ones who also solved the crisis of naval manpower in 406 and were immediately naturalized in large numbers. Half a century later, Demosthenes complained in 351 that METICS and not citizens were the first to be embarked whenever a naval expedition was decided. We are left, therefore, with a glaring contradiction: military obligation without citizenship, actual or prospective. Even though they fulfilled essentially the same military obligations as the citizens, METICS in Athens could not expect to become citizens in due course, unlike their modern counterparts. In the United States, for example, military service actually constitutes the most direct shortcut to citizenship. There was not even an established procedure for a METIC to apply for Athenian citizenship. Citizenship was awarded very rarely by the Assembly and only on an individual basis. Over a period of 130 years, between 480 and 350, there are less than 100 known cases. That is, not even one per year. Very few, if any, involve METICS. According to Aristotle's Politics, at the beginning of the Athenian democracy, Cleisthenes had enrolled in the new tribes many METICS who had been foreigners or slaves. Thereafter, one had to be born an Athenian, that is, from an Athenian father. The closed ethnic or tribal character of the citizen body was actually exacerbated by a law proposed by Pericles in 451. Henceforth, both father and mother had to be Athenians if one was to be accepted as a citizen and partake of the city, in Aristotle's lapidary formulation. Obviously, this restriction placed limits on available military manpower. The Athenians became keenly aware of this on two occasions. One was the acute crisis of naval manpower in 406, already mentioned. They then offered citizenship even to slaves, although Diodorus mentions only METICS and other foreigners. The other occasion was the panic following the Athenian disaster at the Battle of Cheronia in 338. The Assembly then voted freedom for the slaves, citizenship for the METICS, and restoration of political rights to those deprived of them. Clearly, citizenship for the METICS serving in the Athenian army or navy was not unthinkable, as both instances demonstrate. On the contrary, in an emergency, it cropped up naturally as an obvious measure. Why did the Athenians fail to address the issue in normal times? The reasons can only be surmised because there was never a proposal or a discussion on the subject, not even on the part of major political thinkers. Himself a METIC in Athens, Aristotle was apparently never bothered by the military obligation imposed on the METICS, even though it contradicted his own argument linking political rights to one's personal contribution to the defense of the polis. His total silence on the matter is indeed remarkable. And there have been some articles on whether and to what extent his own status as a METIC influenced what Aristotle wrote or did not write. From someone as conservative, as practical, and as experienced in military matters as Xenophon, one would expect a more coherent and satisfactory treatment of the issue of METICS and their military obligation. As it turns out, he is full of contradictions. In his last work, Ways and Means, or Pori, his concern is to attract rich METICS to Athens. Accordingly, he proposes to exempt METICS from hoplite service altogether, while at the same time opening cavalry service to them. Despite his eagerness to attract rich METICS, it is telling that Xenophon does not even conceive that they might be offered the prospect of eventual citizenship. This is all the more striking since he specifically wants to attract or woo those deprived of citizenship elsewhere. In their case, therefore, two potential objections against citizenship for other METICS would not apply. No double citizenship would ensue, since they had lost their original one. Also, no barbarians would be among them, since only Greeks could be apolides, without a city. We may conclude that in normal times, opening citizenship to the METICS seems to have been something of a taboo subject for the otherwise voluble Athenians. We can only speculate about the underlying reasons and about their contemporary relevance. The security risks arising from potentially divided loyalties may appear obvious to us today, but these risks do not seem relevant in the Athenian case if METIC hoplites were routinely entrusted with the guard of walls and forts. In other words, were offered what has always been the ideal opportunity for treason. Perhaps most revealing of Athenian attitudes was the passage in 451 of the law proposed by Pericles and requiring both parents to be Athenian if one was to be a citizen. The only reason hinted at by Aristotle is the multitude of citizens, δια το πλήθος των πολιτών. Presumably, the aim was to reduce the number of those entitled to public office and to manifold material benefits by virtue of their Athenian citizenship. In his Life of Pericles, Plutarch sought to dramatize the effect of the new law by recounting what happened soon thereafter when the Pharaoh of Egypt donated a consignment of grain to be distributed among Athenian citizens. Almost 5,000 who had escaped notice were deprived of citizenship in accordance with the new law and were sold into slavery. This remained the penalty for anyone pretending to be a citizen. For the Athenians, safeguarding the integrity of the citizen body became an obsession, as they considered themselves special in various ways, and above all, autochthonous to Attica, αυτόχθονες, hence entitled to its land also as individuals, to the exclusion of outsiders. Apart from the right to own land in Attica itself or else in an Athenian cleruchy or settlement, the material benefits of citizenship included not only occasional distributions of money or food, but also pay for public service in the courts and in the council or vouli, and eventually also for attending the assembly and even theatrical performances. It is therefore all these symbolic and material benefits that born Athenians jealously kept for themselves and refused to share with METICS by granting them citizenship, however selectively, irrespective of their length of stay or military service. The most unfair case was surely that of METICS, who participated in the struggle for the restoration of democracy in 403, like the orator Lysias. They were first granted citizenship on the proposal of Thrasybulus, but then were deprived of it when the assembly changed its mind. To interpret Aristotle and thereby also justify the Athenians, or at least Pericles, some scholars have argued that in 451, Athens, I quote, simply had too many citizens to function properly as a polis. End of quote. This is misleading. Even after the new law, Attica remained too big, both in size and in citizen population for direct democracy to function properly, at least as we idealize it. Only 6,000 was the quorum required for assembly decisions concerning individuals, like ostracism or grants of citizenship. 6,000. Otherwise, no quorum was required, and participation must have been even less. In any event, it rarely, if ever, exceeded 20 or 25% at most of the total number of citizens. Simultaneously and paradoxically, the citizen population was also too small. For the annual selection by lot of those wishing to fill some 1,100 public offices, including the 500 seats of the Council, if they could hold each position only once in their lifetime. This is no doubt why in the 4th century citizens were allowed to serve not one but 2 terms on the Council, though not consecutive terms. In the end, one cannot escape comparing Athenian, or indeed Greek citizenship in general, to Roman citizenship. As we know, Roman citizenship was gradually extended to new groups and eventually to the entire free population of the empire. By that time, however, it meant nothing in terms of political participation. This depressing trade-off between easily attainable citizenship and actual participation in democratic politics may well be inevitable, especially in a multicultural setting. Thank you, and let me take we have 5 minutes for questions, objections. Good.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Alison Wolfe, University of London. Do we know whether there were, I'm sure you do know, whether in other Greek city-states there was a similar opposition to offering citizenship to METICS, or were there would have been relatively fewer of them? I don't know whether it's recorded, and I'd just be interested to know what we know about it.
As you know, on most matters we know a fair amount about Athens, although the gaps are huge, and practically nothing about other polis or democracies or oligarchies. But if I remember correctly, the 1 or 2 cases that we know of, the situation was not different in terms of METICS. I'm not sure they even call them METICS. METICS is an Athenian institution from very early on. I don't know if you imagine Sparta granting citizenship, and actually, as far as military manpower is concerned, we all know that Sparta, from a great power, withered away because of pure reproduction, biological reproduction. Whereas the Roman legions, of course, were constantly replenished with non-Romans who won the citizenship.
Comparisons with today, with this topic you chose.
Yes.
And whether you could elaborate a little bit on the comparisons.
Yeah. I am no expert on multiculturalism. Professor Gartonash has dealt with the issue extensively. I'm simply making a hint that multiculturalism cannot be reconciled with various forms of, or easily reconciled, with various forms of democratic participation that we might consider as essential to democracy. Or to put it in a different way, multiculturalism can be more easily reconciled with representative institutions, since we know that multi-ethnic empires like Austro-Hungary could accommodate, to some extent, multi-ethnic various ethnic communities through parliaments. So representative democracy and multiculturalism to some extent might be compatible. Direct democracy, I don't think so, because after all, direct democracy also requires a common set of values and a common set of concepts, ideas, for the arguments pro and con to be exchanged. And with identity politics nowadays, each group holds its banner or its whatever holy symbol, and that's, that may lead to some sort of form of coexistence, in my view, peaceful, hopefully, but not to the debate and common decision that traditional democracy implies. Yes, thank you.